It's obvious why legendary president Vicente Calderon called his Atletico Madrid team El Pupas. Perennially the third most successful Spanish football team, cowering under the weighty shadows of those Catalans over there, as well as some lofty neighbours of greater, regal renown. They should be celebrated, yet aren't. Atletico Madrid have won 11 league championships, the third most in the country, coupled with 10 Copa del Rey crowns, fourth most in Spain. If we remove the Clasico teams, Atletico have chalked up the most titles by a Spanish club in the Cup Winners' Cup and Super Cup, only sitting behind Sevilla in the Europa League silverware rankings. They've been to the final of the Champions League more too. But that is where El Pupas swiftly comes in. The Schwarzenbeck of Brussels in 1974, the Ramos of Lisbon in 2014, the Juanfran and Griezmann of Milan in 2016. Seconds, millimetres, whatever measurement you want to quantify the misfortune Atletico Madrid. In another universe, they sit pretty as one of the proudest clubs in world football. Yet they aren't, not even in their golden age, in which we currently inhabit. Atletico Madrid didn't always used to be such. They were founded in 1903, named Athletic Bilbao Cercle de Madrid, thanks to 3 Basque students who founded them. Initially, of course, this came as a collaboration with Athletic Club. In 1911, they donned the famous red and white, only splitting from their Basque ties a decade later. The 20s, being a roaring success for Atleti, earned them a place in the inaugural La Liga season, but quickly they crashed into the depression of second-tier football come the 1930s. Yet another relegation was caught by the onset of war. Whilst the Spanish Civil War arguably hit Atletico the hardest, it provided them a reprieve as far as their relegation went. Also, they emerged with the Air Force in the thick of the Spanish Civil War. Quickly thereafter, league titles followed, in 1940 and 41, and only 6 years later came to be known as Atletico Madrid, before championships were delivered again in succession and once again at the beginning of the decade. This success, however, came 5 years too soon. By the time of Wolves, Honved, floodlit football and the continental game, Atleti's successors were sporadic. Meanwhile, Barcelona and Real Madrid jostled to become the kings of Europe. The latter won out. The 70s, however, would be their decade. Luis Aragonés was the hero of the day, Vicente Calderon the ubiquitous president, and a sparkling new stadium soon to be renamed in his honour. Aragonés was part of the team that dared to venture into the European Cup final, when Johan Cruyff couldn't at Barcelona and Real Madrid struggled to endure a rare lean spell in their history. 3 league titles, 2 Copa del Reys to boot, and Aragonés thought he'd scored the winner 114 minutes into their first European Cup final. Of course, this is Atletico Madrid, nothing is ever that simple, and after falling prey to an equaliser and a replay battering, they'd stay away for 40 years. Not for the want of trying. Luis Aragonés took on the mantle of Atletico's saviour, this time from the dugout, across 7 stints and almost 30 years. He was the suit lifting aloft the last La Liga trophy before one Diego Simeone came to town, with 3 Copa del Rey medals in 3 separate decades. It's a miracle he spent so long affiliated to the club, really. In 1987, Vicente Calderon passed away, and with him, a little bit of Atletico's charm departed. Jesus Gil of questionable extracurricular activity fame succeeded him as president before closing the academy in one of the biggest hotbeds of European football. 16 years he was in charge, 39 managers left quaking underneath his rule. He saw to their relegation in 2000. The ills that were so finely masked by the domestic double of '96 eventually unveiled in protracted fashion. The man at the heart of the La Liga and Copa del Rey double, one Diego Simeone. Under the Clasico cloud, Atleti had developed an underdog mentality, with the Argentine epitomising that. Signed from Sevilla in 1994, Simeone was a tenacious midfielder, a player almost bred for the club's mentality at the time, a mentality that they can never quite shake to this day. Of recent years, of course, it was down to the perennial servant Luis Aragonés to usher Atletico back to the top flight. Finally, there was born a stability with Jesus Gil's exiting, even if his successor Enrique Cerezo continued the culture of sacking, as the head of Aragonés rolled. The Cerezo era becomes known largely for two things: the role in front of kit sponsors depicting films from Hellboy to Spider-Man 2, and a calibre of centre-forward that excited the country. Almost to make up for Raúl slipping the academy net, Atletico burned through legendary figures: Fernando Torres, Diego Forlán, and Sergio Aguero. Still though, they'd be a cut underneath the Clasico and their satellites of the time, Sevilla, Deportivo and Villarreal, who were more prominent in Europe. In 2010, however, it was Atleti's time to step up to the plate. Quique Sanchez Flores delivered the club's first continental trophy since the 60s by defeating Fulham in the 2010 Europa League final. Ultimately, however, it was a trophy that only temporarily kept the guillotine from cascading through the manager's neck. His demise brought about a pivot to Rafael Benitez, to Luis Enrique, to Unai Emery as a choice to take the club forward. Atletico received none of them, instead appointing Gregorio Manzano. Manzano was a journeyman figure, previously at the club in 2004, who had impressively qualified Real Mallorca for Europe since. His failure could have been easily foreshadowed when he declared, "No soy incapaz." It didn't take long at all for him to be revealed as muy incapaz. He lost figureheads in David De Gea, Sergio Aguero and Diego Forlán in his first transfer window. His safety net was sporting director José Luis Caminero, who delivered him Thibaut Courtois, Radamel Falcao, Arda Turan, Diego, Thiago, Gabi and Miranda on a silver platter. Despite this calibre of talent fresh off the production line, they were crushed inside 3 matches by Barcelona. Manzano would win just 3 more league games, disposed of in December, with the club going nowhere fast, out of the Copa to third-tier Albacete and a toxicity sweeping through the club and up to the supporters. In its final game at home to Real Betis on December the 18th, 2011, he cowered in his dugout. After a second-half concession, he revealed himself to his audience that bayed for his blood. They'd conceded the 3rd highest goals in the league, were unimaginative going forward, and less than a week after the defeat to Betis, Manzano was gone. The man tasked with taking the club back, Diego Pablo Simeone, El Cholo. Diego Simeone was raised on a diet of Argentina's most glorious period and perhaps their greatest gift, Diego Maradona. With him and the country's global triumphs of 78 and 86, Simeone's future was long sealed. Before he reached the Vicente Calderon stadium, the midfielder already possessed a storied career. He initiated the 90s with a pair of Copa America titles that La Albiceleste claimed without Maradona. The man responsible for bringing El Cholo to European football between those Copa successes was Carlos Bilardo, manager of Argentina in their greatest heyday of 1986. After 2 years at Sevilla, Atletico came calling in the middle of the decade. Simeone underpinned the flesh of what it meant to be a colchonero. In 1994, Atletico Madrid were a shambles, to put it mildly. They had survived relegation by a point and sped through almost a handful of managers. Then Rade Antic stepped into the breach, unlocked the industry of Simeone, who netted a career-best 12 goals in the 1995-96 season, the campaign Atleti won the Spanish double. Simeone came to the attention of British audiences for his part in David Beckham's red card during the France 98 last 16 encounter between Argentina and England. The Manchester United star's petulant kick sent Simeone to the ground in instalments and was enough to warrant a sending off and a subsequent defeat. Win at all costs, the Simeone mantra was unveiled for all the world to see. Via Inter, Lazio and a return to Atletico in the early 2000s, Simeone returned to his homeland equipped with the concrete idea that he would become a football manager. Naturally, that chapter of his life begun in Argentina and was hit and miss, to say the least. At Racing Club, he was promoted from the position of player to sitting in the hot seat in February 2006. 3 months and a presidential change later, he departed. While stints at River Plate and San Lorenzo were relatively sparse on the ground for success, Simeone proved his mettle with a league title at Estudiantes, as well as a successful first venture into European football. Catania were a Serie A club struggling to stay afloat in the top flight. Within 6 months, El Cholo had kept them up. He couldn't stay away from his homeland for long, however, returning to Racing for yet another short-lived tenure, this time at 19 matches. Nothing would prepare football for what happened next. When his beloved Atletico came calling, Simeone had to answer the call. The first and most pressing matter in his entry was reinstalling an ethos that was befitting of his club. His Machiavellian maxims of his playing days were plain to see. He simply wasn't a manager who wanted to earn a point, but more so demanded his players stopped the opposition from gaining all 3. He was joined by trusty assistant Germán Burgos, as well as fitness coach Oscar Ortega, who had followed him throughout his managerial journey. Burgos and Simeone played bad cop, whilst Ortega was returning to the club in the same position he held upon Simeone's return to the club as a player in 2003. The club was hemorrhaging both cash and players. They didn't have the finances and averaged a staggering 14 new players per season since 1996. And yet, it was a team that had somehow managed to maintain a good age profile with some invaluable experienced heads and a healthy core of peak age players. One player that Simeone did have to lose before the empire started to take shape, though, was Jose Antonio Reyes, who had sufficiently burned his bridges at the club prior to the appointment of Simeone. The dead wood would be cut at the first opportunity too, mere weeks after Simeone had delivered Atletico the Europa League of 2012. 7 players exited, whilst Christian Rodriguez was the only senior figure in. The following year, despite the club's uptick in fortunes by qualifying for the Champions League, winning the Copa del Rey and banking over €60 million on Radamel Falcao, they didn't make wholesale changes to the squad. 2 years after making the Colombian their most expensive player, Falcao had tore up La Liga, scoring 12 goals in their Europa League winning campaign of 2012. He would be an enormous miss. David Villa was his replacement headline signing, whilst Toby Alderweireld and Jose Maria Jimenez were signings that either underperformed in the case of the Belgian or simply weren't ready for the first team yet, as proven with Jimenez. Diego's loan was turned permanent as Atletico made sure to stay careful in the transfer market. They had traversed some incredible landmarks. The 3-0 victory over Marcelo Bielsa's Athletic Club in Bucharest's 2012 Europa League final, the first. Comfortably the biggest came the spring the year after. Atletico Madrid hadn't beaten their illustrious neighbours in any competition in the 21st century. October the 29th, 1999, in a La Liga contest at the Bernabeu, Jimmy Floyd Hasselbank scored 2 in a 3-1 win of the eventual European champions. Since, pure misery. Outside of a 2-legged quarter-final elimination in the Copa del Rey in 2011, El Derby was played 23 times in La Liga and 23 times Atletico failed to win. In that spell, Atleti gained just 6 draws, 5 of which quirkily came at the Bernabeu, and for 2 years, the derby wasn't even played, owing to Atletico's place in the second tier of Spanish football. That depression ended on the night of May 17, 2013, at the Bernabeu, of all places. When Cristiano Ronaldo scored to give the incumbent La Liga champions the lead, the same old story appeared to be written. But when Diego Costa levelled the game and Miranda bulleted an extra-time header into the net, Atletico ended 14 years of hurt and lifted their second trophy of the Simeone era. The Simeone legend at the Vicente Calderon was already built in. Now he was busy getting to work on developing it even further. Nobody had had a sniff of La Liga outside the Clasico duopoly for a long time. Not since the days of Rafael Benitez, Valencia in 2004 had a team outside of Real Madrid and Barcelona got to within 17 points of the eventual league winner. In his season preview for The Guardian, Sid Lowe remarked, "Madrid and Barcelona long since disappeared into the distance, and no one is even trying to chase them anymore." The other 18 clubs in Spain's top flight were due to be served their just desserts, and they were simply supposed to accept it and swallow it gladly. What nobody would foresee is that one team would not allow that to happen. Diego Simeone went with the crowd in the opening stages of his reign as far as rudimentary numbers that denote a formation are concerned. The 4-3-3 was the choice of its day, some say it still is, but Simeone's Atletico diverged ever so slightly off course even with this. At Atletico, the 4-3-3 was more akin to the 4-4-2 that the Rojiblanco supporters would come to know and love. That is to say, if one winger would dare to push forward, the other would drop into midfield. Whatever the tactic that the 10 were asked to deploy in front of him, the goalkeeper's role would largely remain unchanged in Simeone's first half-decade at the club. Thanks to the defensive positioning of Atletico, the first aim of a Simeone goalkeeper was rooted in the tradition of claiming the ball from crosses and being aerially dominant in set-piece scenarios. Hence, when they stumbled across the long frame of goalkeeping prodigy Thibaut Courtois, Atleti had to have him. Unfortunately, in the long run, the Belgian was destined for London after Genk, not that Simeone wasn't able to tie him down to a long-term loan or two. El Cholo didn't inherit the best-case scenario between the sticks, as David De Gea had been sold 5 months prior to his arrival. Meanwhile, Sergio Asenjo was relatively inexperienced and didn't have a similarly high ceiling of potential. Come the end of a dizzying 820-minute spell without conceding in the 2012-13 season, Courtois had won the number 1 jersey. His place in the team was now unassailable, even in his very early 20s. Alas, it wouldn't be a sweet ending between supporter and player, given Courtois quickly found himself back in Madrid after a successful stint in London. Not though back to the Vicente Calderon or its successor, but to Los Blancos across town. Furthermore, with Courtois' claim that winning the Champions League with Real Madrid would quote-unquote be a dream untrue, Atleti fans were quick to act, throwing toy rats at him in his first Madrid derby on the other side of the divide. It's easy to figure out where the core or a spine of a football team is. Many plump for the very literal central core of centre-back, central midfielder and centre-forward. For Simeone, it could be argued it was his fullbacks. The manager stated, "With great fullbacks, it's easy to figure out the rest of the players, and that great fullbacks can adapt." Simeone's wide defenders were told to remain reserved, told to pick their opportunity to burst forward with the reference point of their wingers ahead of them. Should they sit narrow, the fullback would overlap. Should they drift wide, compactness alongside the centre-half was the order. This gave Atletico an air of fluidity and unpredictability, 2 facets that made their counter-attacking play insatiable. Juanfran was the star of the show here, firmly transitioned back into the right side of defence and remains one of Diego Simeone's great success stories. On the other flank sat Felipe Luis, another player who had been repurposed. The Brazilian initially joined as an attacking midfielder, and whilst he did have to endure an uncomfortable transition to European football, Simeone found him his home at left back. Out of possession, the Atleti defence cut 4 equidistant figures in the backline. Centrally, the plan was to shrink the pitch and let the opposition play outside, safe in the knowledge that the centre-backs would deal with absolutely everything thrown into the box. Simeone needed fighters, grafters in his centre-back positions. Who else epitomises that more in his career and in his life than Diego Godin? The Uruguayan, who almost drowned as a child, took on that survival instinct either side of the white line. A genuinely world-class star, his positioning, composure and overall reading of the game was nailed down to a fine art. Godin was said to have scored some of the most important goals in Atleti's history, netting in the 2014 Champions League final as well as the La Liga winning equaliser at the Camp Nou. However, his defensive partner could lay claim to an even more important strike. Miranda scored when it was imperative to do so. It could be argued that his goal that won the 2013 Copa del Rey final laid the foundations for Atleti's golden age. With those names entrenched in these tactics, it's plain to see why Diego Simeone's Atletico Madrid are often lauded first and foremost defensively. However, it is the midfield of 2014 that underpinned the entire team. Contrary to popular belief, Simeone didn't opt for a low block. Instead, he instructed his team to sit slightly off in a mid-block. Both central midfielders would share the defensive duties, but one would be designated to step up and press. Yes, Atleti often deployed a 4-4-2, but closer to the truth is probably the numbers 4-1-3-2 in somewhat of a diamond formation. With the wide midfielders naturally narrow, it allowed for a 3-man press of both attackers alongside the more offensively minded midfielder. As this happens, the deeper midfielder would split the centre halves to form a situational back three and give flexibility to the fullbacks. This is common practice today, less so in the early 2010s. When discussing Atletico midfielders, you absolutely have to be mindful of Simeone's stint at the club in the 90s. But the one that resonates now is Gabi. The Spaniard was integrated into the first team in the 2005-06 season, but eventually found himself at Real Zaragoza. Like so many of this wonderful team, however, he circled back to the club, returning in 2011 before being appointed captain the following year. Uncapped for his national team, Gabi has been front and centre for everything good that Atletico did in the first phase of Simeone's time. Integral right down to being the one to find Diego Godin with crosses for goals against Barcelona and Real Madrid in the most important games at the end of the 2013-14 season. Attaching a label to those players that often ply their trade between the lines of midfield and attack or the half space and channel is difficult, now more so than ever. You've got inside forwards, you've got wingers, inverted wingers, defensive wingers, wide midfielders, round-outers, the lot. Although wingers has been the more prevalent in that terminology over the past 50 years, you'd be hard-pressed to find an actual winger in a Diego Simeone team. Whilst we have described this team to be deployed in a 4-1-3-2, perhaps it was more of a 4-2-2, and the wide attacker's job was primarily to ensure that the game was played over as small an area as possible. As mentioned, they were to tuck in, both to limit opponents' space and to necessitate wide attack from marauding fullbacks. Be it a pressing trap, an auxiliary attacker, or a conduit for a defender to burst forward, Simeone installed the same flexibility into his wide attackers as he did with his wide defenders. And much like Felipe Luis and Juanfran, who weren't really fullbacks, Simeone's wingers weren't really wingers either. Koke, naturally a central midfielder, was often utilised out wide, largely for using his technical abilities further forward, but also for his defensive savvy to tuck in. Xavi once predicted that he would be the conductor of Spain's orchestra for the next 10 years. Whilst you'd expect a conductor like Xavi to be utilised centrally, you'd struggle to disagree that Koke dictated a lot of Atleti's play. The positional change was a win-win for club and player. Koke was introduced to regular first-team football under Simeone midway through the 2012-13 season, viewed as a successor to both Gabi in midfield and to Diego Godin as the captain. He would grow into that armband eventually, wearing it for the first time in March 2015. On the other side, Atletico created the most expensive Turkish footballer of all time in Arda Turan. Signed in 2011, Turan was in the same mould as Koke, an industrious but highly technical player to use quote-unquote wide, yet was more the team's creative hub in the final third. In England, the managers that are looked down upon usually have a couple of things in common: the 4-4-2, the direct game, the target man. Diego Simeone, while similarly viewed to be playing negative football by supporters, pundits, managers and players alike, breaks another preconception down with his use, or lack thereof, of a target man. With the outlier of Mario Mandzukic, Simeone often opted to have two very similar players deployed in central attacking areas. It gave teammates more options, be it directly or intricately, with their passing. In the earlier days of Simeone, one attacker was to cover the groundwork touchline to touchline, whilst the other led the press. The former, covering forward, helped out the midfield, as players such as Adrian Lopez would grow to enormous stature at the club. A more famous example, though, is Diego Costa, a player used to accommodate the likes of Radamel Falcao or David Villa, who would find a barrage of goals. Diego Costa is a self-confessed Machiavellian. A man who once said, "I had no respect for opponents, I thought I had to kill them." He was in the same mould as Gabi, who was signed in the mid-2000s only for several loan departures to postpone his peak. Costa found his feet under Quique Sanchez Flores, but breaking into the team wasn't plain sailing, as only a failed medical halted a transfer to Besiktas. Upon Diego Simeone's arrival, he must have recognised he had a kindred spirit in his team, so loaned him out to Rayo Vallecano to get up to match speed. It proved the catalyst of things to come. The following year, alongside Falcao, the naturalised Spaniard netted 27 La Liga goals, i.e. the best tally outside of the obvious two gold fiends. For much as he is an epitome of Diego Simeone's Atletico Madrid, his story is somewhat bittersweet. Whilst he was there to lift the La Liga and Copa del Rey honours, he would be substituted off injured in the most important matches, the 2013-14 finale against Barca and the 2014 Champions League final. Furthermore, he would return in 2017 and his greatness continued, only for it to grind to a halt midway through Atleti's second La Liga winning campaign, departing 5 months before the championship was clinched. The first of Simeone's championships really got off the ground in September 2013, a number of months after Miranda had fired Atleti to Copa success ahead of their city rivals. Diego Costa carried on the club's newfound dominance over Real by slamming in an 11th minute goal at the Bernabeu. The first win over Real in 14 years had quickly followed with their first league win over their nearest and dearest. After keeping in close contact with the title race more so than any non-Clasico club had since Rafael Benitez lifted the trophy with Valencia a decade prior, the belief finally came in March 2014. At least a trip to the Basque Country was the landmark which Simeone admitted belief crept into his thinking. All the while, Atletico did go 1-0 down away at Athletic when Ika Munayin struck for the home side. Diego Costa, ever the important goalscorer, pegged them level before Koke nodded a winner in to keep Los Colchoneros a point in front with 7 to play. This is Atletico Madrid we're talking about, however. There had to be some wobbles and they inevitably arrived at their doorstep in May 2014. First Levante, who dispatched of Simeone's team 2-0, a team who had threatened to take La Liga by storm a couple of years prior but now were a pale imitation. If that was disappointing, then so too was a 1-1 draw at the Vicente Calderon against Malaga, another team who had descended from their 2012 peak. It was a weekend where Atletico simply needed to better the results of Barcelona, who were held at Elche 0-0, and of Real Madrid, who contrived to lose 2-0 in Vigo. Toby Alderweireld rescued the point for Atletico, but they ought to have had all three and the title sewn up. However, Adrian Lopez had a glorious chance thwarted by Malaga goalkeeper Willy Caballero. With that opportunity evaporating into thin air, Atletico now had to earn the title the hard way, away at Barcelona, with just a point left to gain. It appeared as though Simeone's flirting with the title was to be just that. 1 week later, the Argentine was moved to describe the contest as pure history. His players were dropping like flies, consumed by injury, and soon enough, Barcelona penetrated Atletico to go ahead for the first time in 6 meetings that season. Alexis Sanchez's goal compounded the misery felt by the stricken Turan and Costa, but Simeone's point of view come the end of the match was that Atletico had shown that there is more than one way to win. They'd gone on excursions that season to tough places like Sevilla, Malaga, Villarreal, Bilbao, to the Bernabeu. They'd avoided defeat in every single one of those trips. A 0-0 draw at home to Barcelona in the reverse meant they needed just one more goal. Hence why Diego Godin's equaliser was a championship winning goal. Their 13th and final set-piece La Liga goal, Atletico led those rankings and the leagues come the end of the game. This was a team that hadn't sat atop La Liga not even for a single week for 16 years before the 2013-14 season. Now they were champions on a much stricter budget ahead of the Clasico teams. Pure history, indeed. If ever a prize comparison between teams was justified, it's from this season. The 11 that finished Atletico's title-winning game at the Camp Nou cost the club €40 million. Put into perspective, it was half a Cristiano Ronaldo and barely a full, says Fabregas. 200,000 decked the streets of Madrid to see Atleti's heroes to celebrate with the statue of Neptune for the second time in a year, after so long away. Even in glory though, there was a thorn in Atleti's side. They were to parade to celebrate without the trophy, due to the Football Federation's president being otherwise busy for both Barcelona's final match and for the parade. Instead, Diego Simeone stood, chest out, prideful, and dripping in his us against the world mantra when he declared that nobody could take the title off them. His most pertinent line read, "This is not just a league, what this triumph transmits is much more important than that. If you believe and if you work, you can do it." Yet they still had one more job left. Both halves of Madrid traversed the Iberian Peninsula in any which way they could for perhaps the biggest match in Spanish football's long and illustrious history. Lisbon, perhaps one of the more fitting places for a match of such grandeur to be held. Cristiano Ronaldo, back in his homeland, was set to lead his La Decima chase in Real Madrid in front of those who adored him. Diego Simeone and his 11 soldiers would do anything they could to stop that from happening. Again thwarted by the injury of Diego Costa, who was a blatant risk from the start, Atleti struck first in the Estadio de Luz. Again it was from a Gabi corner, this time beaten out by Real but ultimately not thwarted when Diego Godin's hopeful backwards header caught Iker Casillas in no man's land. Just another set-piece goal to add to the scrapbook, it might have been Atletico's most important yet. Had it not been for Sergio Ramos as the clock lapsed from 92:47 into 92:48. And for all the success that Atletico Madrid had had over the past year or so, they are called El Pupas for a reason. Such is the other side of the coin. Whilst Real Madrid toiled on the continent for much of the previous decade, they are the kings of Europe for a reason. The weight of that history effectively ended the match as a contest there and then, despite Atletico's form, grit, determination, and everything that comes with that. Gareth Bale, Marcelo, and Cristiano Ronaldo ensured the game ran away from Atleti. Bale, scorer of the second, summed it up best when he said, "I felt that when we got the equaliser, we had the momentum going into extra time and we looked a bit fresher." The Champions League wasn't to be, but Diego Simeone had what almost every club in Europe desired, including the Clasico behemoths. He'd won more than both Barcelona or Real Madrid in the prior 3 years, with the successes of the Super Cup, Copa del Rey, Europa League and La Liga. He'd done so on a relatively shoestring budget with much of the same team that he inherited slumped into mid-table in Christmas 2011. The captain Gabi claimed that the players felt sunk prior to that Christmas managerial change. And whilst temporarily, yes, they would be diagnosed with the same sinking feeling as they lost a second Champions League final, they were infinitely in a better place. In football, if you amount to anything and are not necessarily supposed to, you will be torn limb from limb for even daring to try and unseat those of more traditional power. History has given us countless examples of this. For example, Portuguese football is the walking embodiment of such a phenomenon. And whilst Atletico Madrid were stripped of a number of their component parts, from Diego, Adrian Lopez and David Villa to Felipe Luis and Diego Costa, they bought quick and they bought well. Thibaut Courtois too needed to be replaced, so in came Jan Oblak, and quickly the cracks weren't papered over, but the plaster of Antoine Griezmann, Angel Correa and Mario Mandzukic was applied to the walls of the Calderon. Before anybody could flinch in the market, Antoine Griezmann was seized from Real Sociedad, his €30 million release clause paid at the click of a finger, which almost matched the expenditure of Atletico's entire starting 11 the prior season. It was a sign of things to come. Whilst Griezmann took a while to understand or get Atletico Madrid and Diego Simeone, by 2016 he was the poster boy for the club. He strode into his peak, dazzling front and centre in another Atletico Madrid run to a Champions League final in 2016. Unfortunately for someone so inextricably linked to the club, he would be snatched away by bigger sharks, only to return after another La Liga success for Atleti. In the meantime, the club had been ceilinged to third as Diego Simeone looked to violently regenerate. Over 1,000 combined club appearances dissolved in 2015 with the departures of Arda Turan, Mario Suarez, Miranda and Raul Garcia. Gabi too would depart, Theo Hernandez too for big money, and while some signings such as Nico Gayton, Jota, Kevin Gamero and Jackson Martinez wouldn't work, there were success stories in what had become a market inflated by Neymar, Barcelona and the like. Reputationally, Simeone was playing with house money. His star in the eyes of Atleti fans could not fall. Financially, Atletico returned to the market again and again with enormous gambles. Rodri cost €40 million, Vitolo similarly priced, and Diego Costa returned for a staggering €60 million. Thomas Lemar's $72 million obliterated that barrier before João Felix applied a dizzying tinge to proceedings, his €125 million fee likely to stand as a club record forevermore. His was the headline figure, whilst Marcos Llorente, Mario Hermoso, Renan Lodi, Felipe and Kieran Trippier rotated in and out of view. 15, 20, €30 million chucked around like nobody's business. And yet forget about that and just look the other way. Antoine Griezmann, Rodri, Luca Hernandez, Thomas Partey, Alvaro Morata all sold for similarly game-changing sums. In the end, it took a global pandemic to slow the rate of Atleti's spending. Come the end of it, however, Simeone had a new team and a new tactical schematic to work from. Possession was seen as key, with fluidity and movement trusty lieutenants. It proved unsuccessful though in attacking quarters. The 4-3-3 returned, but less so in the Simeone mould, as his calibre of players all but demanded a more Barcelona philosophy. But it was mere tribute act. Paradoxically, with more freedom came less joy. There remained flickers of brilliance, the run to the 2016 Champions League final, a triumph again in Europe, with the 2018 Europa League over Marseille, and brief flings with a title race. The points differences in La Liga, however, returned to an age more accustomed to between Benitez 04 and Simeone 14. They tried to pivot, they tried to riddle themselves with the esteem that money and success demands, but their reputation had to be upheld. El Pupas they attempted to caricature in May 2016 when they arrived at another Champions League final in San Siro. Fated as it was, their opponents were once again Real Madrid. They were there to be beaten, a team who had changed their coach midway through the season after a dismal league campaign. It was therefore now or never. The cruelty bestowed on Antoine Griezmann and Juanfran, who missed penalties in both normal time and in the shootout, infers that it might be the latter. Despite Atletico's travails going forward, despite their attempts to branch out tactically, they were shackled to a defensive brilliance increasingly seen all too rarely on the continent. After an away goals elimination in the semi-finals, Bayern Munich's Arturo Vidal remarked, "The only time they saw the ball was for the goal." Be it in successful times much like those, or in lesser times, an upturned nose would follow the football of Atletico Madrid, trying to sniff out a reason for it all. Be it Jurgen Klopp or Pep Guardiola in recent bouts of gatekeeping from those who, quote-unquote, play football properly, or the army of social media foot soldiers and pundits in which they embolden. For as long as Diego Simeone is manager of Atletico Madrid, so the discourse will continue. Come 2019 though, there was a new identity said to be forming. João Felix was signed, plus they'd battered Real Madrid 7-3 in pre-season. As much as a new identity might have been burgeoning in the shadows or for the public to see, the 20s were born with a classical Atletico display. Liverpool won the Champions League in Atletico's home in 2019, so the Spaniards decided to end their defence 9 months later in their home. It birthed the name of Marcos Llorente's dog and perpetuated the stereotype that Atletico Madrid play, quote-unquote, this kind of football. For the fair weather, nothing had changed. The changes, though, had already been made. Atletico Madrid had a brand new expansive game of football, and that much is obvious when delving into the role of the goalkeeper. Thibaut Courtois' successor Jan Oblak wasn't much of the football-first, goalkeeping-second variety that many number ones prescribe to these days, but more modern goalkeeping elements had crept into the club. The Slovenian was now tasked with defending higher up the pitch and did so much more frequently than any recent iteration of Simeone's teams. Oblak was signed as the most expensive La Liga goalkeeper off the back of winning a domestic treble in Portugal with Benfica. Struggling to find his feet, Oblak soon let his hands do the talking for him. His performances against Real Madrid and Bayer Leverkusen in the last 16 ties of the Copa del Rey and Champions League respectively earned him the number 1 jersey that he has yet to give up. On the face of it, the defence had undergone the starkest change between Simeone's title-winning teams. If anything, the formation in number form certainly inferred that. Atleti had run into a problem in the intervening years. They weren't good going forward, and there was suddenly an inability to utilise both full-backs as an attacking force. Whilst the deeper central midfielder almost naturally dropped into what would become a defensive 3, it spurred on the fullbacks to evolve into wing-backs. Suddenly, Atletico were wider whilst retaining the team's direct nature and their flexibility. The wing-backs had such licence to go forward that often it could be hard to identify that they had made the leap from a back 4 to a back 5 at all. Whilst one wing-back would become a situational winger, the other would tuck into a defence, forming a back 4, with the centre-forwards behaving as before, that is, one leading the press and the other covering wider. A front 3 remained in play. Being a wide defensive position, Simeone knew better than to simply sign and deploy such a player in a defensive position. Instead, in very much the same mould as a Felipe Luis or a Juanfran, he would attach more natural wingers to one of the 2 wing-back berths, understanding that it was easier to teach defending to an attacker than the inverse. Therefore, the defensive winger was the ultimate Simeone chameleon. He could fit the 4-4-2 of 2014, the 4-3-3 of the middle years, or the back 3 or 5 system of the 2020-21 season. Remember when Simeone said, "With great fullbacks it's easier to figure out the rest of the players"? This is exactly what he meant. The temporary 4-4-2 allowed Atletico to press. Alternatively, they could sit into a 5 or even a 6 with a more defensive-minded player as part of the midfield 3. Whilst football's ultimate defensive tactic, the catenaccio, derived from the Swiss bolt, Diego Simeone had eloped from such a system to more of a Swiss army knife. The more successful in this hybrid role was Yannick Carrasco. Like so many before and after him, the Belgian could simply not stay away from the club. Despite allegedly falling out with the manager and the club capitalising on China's newfound interest in the game to make a dime off his sale, Carrasco returned in 2020. He'd scored the equaliser in the 2016 Champions League final against Real Madrid as a winger, and 5 years later he lifted the Liga trophy as a jack-of-all-trades wing-back. On the other side, and perhaps equally as important, Kieran Trippier. Atletico Madrid's first English player in 95 years is a versatile enough wing-back anyway, underpinned with a creativity that suits any top-tier team. His importance more so was seen via the medium of his absence for breaching betting regulations. When he was gone, the double-digit lead he had helped build almost deteriorated, and upon his return, Atleti had stabilised to creak over the line. Either side of the wing-backs, the central midfielder was simply cannibalised by the defence, allowing Simeone to set out an equidistant 3 or 4 depending on the state of play, and here the exterior centre-halves came into their own. Any central defender could now feasibly step out and play football, or have a keen eye for a long pass and quarterback the game from the back line. That retention of Atletico's directness was ruled by Simeone's mantra of keeping the ball as far away from their own net as possible. Centrally, the pillar of Atletico's defence had been there waiting in the shadows for his moment ever since before their first title win under Diego Simeone. Jose Maria Jimenez was signed direct from his Uruguayan homeland in 2013, but didn't come into his own until after the championship-winning campaign the year after. He would make 28 appearances the subsequent year, merely filling in, but in the next few years eventually became one of the first names on the team sheet. The midfield in Simeone's 2021 setup had been tweaked ever so slightly too. Whilst once upon a time there was the mercurial Gabi there to sweep up behind a more pressing central partner, now Atleti adopted a more 3-2 setup defensively. 2 midfielders would sit on top of the 3 central defenders, which sounds aggressively defensive. However, when paired up with 3 wing-backs and a 3rd central midfielder whose primary goal was to be creative, then it soon became a more attacking mode of football. It would be hard to imagine any midfielder in Simeone's 2014 team that was primarily adopted as an attacking fulcrum. By 2021, Atletico arguably had 4 players who were designated as attackers. The man-marking system had become a stringently organised but modern zonal system in the midfield that was filled with overly technical players from Saul to Rodrigo de Paul, as well as the attacking versatility of Marcos Llorente. Moving away from the destroyer pairing of Gabi and Thiago in 2014, Saul was another player contractually obliged to the club in the first championship-winning season. He was made to watch from afar, albeit in the confines of the same city whilst on loan at Rayo Vallecano. Ultimately, however, he would quickly fill the void left by the departures of Mario Suarez and Thiago. Such was his determination for the Atletico Madrid cause that he allegedly suggested a kidney removal just to play for the club. It would appear that Atletico's 2 attackers of 2014 merely did the same job 7 years later to similar results in La Liga. This front line, as aforementioned, with a defensive winger, was incredibly dynamic, however. The covering attacker of 2014 was now almost an inside forward at times when the more attacking wing-back joined the front line. Designed to be an attacking outlet, the wide forward could be utilised almost in the same mould as a Koke or Turan of 2014 when on the back foot. That is to say that this player needed to be defensively astute, yet creative and industrious. They would often forego the glory of goal-getting in favour of the attacking midfielder centrally, almost always Marcos Llorente, whose La Liga scoring record peaked at 12 goals from 37 appearances. As of writing, the Spaniard has only scored 4 La Liga goals outside of the 2021 championship-winning season. Some like to place asterisks on the success of others, no more so was that seen than in the baffling case of Liverpool's rise as champions during the pandemic. Attributing COVID to becoming the game's ultimate leveller would be doing Atletico Madrid an enormous disservice. Entering the new season with a different system and the odd new player, it was evident that one of these new players, Kieran Trippier, was integral to Atleti's success. As aforementioned, the club's league form fluctuated either side of his 12-match ban. His replacement, Versalco, unfortunately couldn't cut it in the meantime. Trippier was an absentee for the club's eventual Champions League elimination in the last 16 to eventual champions Chelsea. Perhaps with more luck of the draw or Kieran Trippier's suspension ruling, we could be discussing an all-time great season. Prior to that suspension, Atletico were not only on course to break their own records, but all records set by any Spanish or European team in domestic competition. 50 points from 19 games and a 10-point lead was the tale of Atleti's first half of the season. Not just defending their way to glory, but an utter evisceration of La Liga. As it was, under new floodlights of the Wanda Metropolitano, some of the El Pupas snuck in, even upon Kieran Trippier's return. They'd been dealt a sickener in the Madrid derby at home on March the 7th when Karim Benzema equalised with 2 minutes left. Moments like that are said to be title deciders, and come the spring it had been a when, not an if, Atletico would cede control of the title to the champions. Whilst this certainly was a new age of Atletico Madrid, they still needed to lean on old crutches to get over the line. Elche were tiptoed beyond 1-0 away from home. Barcelona similarly shut out in a goalless draw. Still, they couldn't shake the inevitable challenge of Real Madrid. It was only on the penultimate weekend of the La Liga season that Real received a taste of their own medicine. 20 minutes changed the entire complexion of the title. As Atletico toiled against Osasuna, Real Madrid snuck ahead in Bilbao through Nacho Fernandez. 8 minutes later, the double punch hit Atletico square in the jaw. Ante Budimir had put Osasuna a goal in front with 15 left on the clock. Diego Simeone was losing his grip on the title, that is until they entered what he called the Suarez zone. Renan Lodi, a man who scored many a crucial goal in sticky scenarios for Atletico that season, came from the bench to equalise with 8 minutes remaining. Then the man that Barcelona had ditched at the roadside, who had brought Atletico in from the cold, delivered the biggest blow of the lot. Luis Suarez, with 2 minutes left, scored to win Atletico Madrid the game and ultimately the league. Not settled with that, Suarez completed a similar nerve-shredding 2-1 comeback on the final day against Real Valladolid. It took until the final day again, it took numerous twists and turns yet again, but Atletico Madrid had finally shaken their challengers from their tail to win the title dramatically. Koke, a man with almost 600 appearances for the club, encapsulated it all by saying, "We wouldn't be Atleti if we didn't suffer." The jinx remains. Atletico Madrid, even equipped with their golden age, remain ordained to exist in the shadows of their country's monolithic institutions. On the rare occasions that they tiptoe out of their desolate surroundings into the champagne of success, they are told that they do not do things the right way. This has reached a fever pitch under the stylings of Diego Simeone, but will likely continue in perpetuity. In the world of the gegenpress, inverted fullbacks and death by 1,000 passes football, Simeone is an antidote of sort. Their resourcefulness birthed bigger arenas to play in, the largest stages to compete within, and every partido along the way, they've resorted to do things differently. They are underpinned with youth, Simeone's average age of acquisitions in his first 10 years coming to 26. They sign on average 7 or 8 players while spending 5 times less than Barcelona. Atletico Madrid and Real Madrid spend the same amount of money, only Atletico gain double the footballers for the same price. The other side of the coin is even more impressive. Whilst Real Madrid and Barcelona, as the final destinations that they are, remain ill-equipped to selling names on for big fees, Diego Simeone sits atop the mountain for the funds he had generated in player sales. €1 billion and counting is a world record. In Simeone's first 11 full seasons, he's picked up 2 of Atletico's 11 championships and finished within the top 3 on every other occasion. For a club that so famously hates to attack, that so famously plays ugly football, that allegedly sits 11 behind the ball in stringent ways, they've developed beautiful footballers and learned to adapt to play as beautiful football. If Radamel Falcao, Diego Costa or David Villa weren't terrorising La Liga defences, then Mario Mandzukic, Antoine Griezmann and Luis Suarez were. Defensively, their might goes without saying, from the partnership of Godin and Miranda to the pillars that are Jan Oblak and Jose Maria Jimenez. They've been served by the loyalty of Gabi and Koke in midfield, lit up by the flair of João Felix and Marcos Llorente further afield. But what of the future? Diego Simeone signed a 3-year deal after leading the club to the 2021 title, due to expire at the end of the season. COVID, like so many others on the continent, has impacted Atletico incredibly hard. Their suddenly large expenditure of the late 2010s was cruelly fought with empty stadiums, wage reductions and crippling debt. Club accounts spoke to almost €700 million in the red as the players celebrated by the statue of Neptune in 2021. Yet, since the second title of Simeone, the optimism has been ground down into familiar haunts. 15 points behind Spanish and European champions in 2022 shrunk to 11 from a resurgent Barcelona in 2023, third place remaining the underlying feature. They're no longer at the forefront of continental innovation, however, merely a pawn to be eliminated at the last 16 or quarter-final by a greater name. Until, in the latest season, they failed to even reach that stage. Alas, that has happened before, hence the lifting of the Europa League trophy in 2018. But in 2023, Atletico have yet to play a single minute of European football after failing to even finish third in a Champions League group that contained Porto, Club Brugge and Bayer Leverkusen. A rousing second half of the season, underpinned by a stirring stoppage time comeback in January against Valencia, did little to shake a feeling that the Simeone era was winding down to a close. Yet, we have fought this before. Is there one more oscillation in Simeone's story in the Spanish capital, or will Atletico have to pivot from a manager who delivered them such glory, a leader who frog-marched them into their new arena, into the grandest occasions that this sport has to offer? Whoever does eventually follow Simeone into the Atletico hot seat has one incredible foundation to settle into, at a time where Atletico need not to settle for their perpetual underdog status.